Pessoal, sejam bem-vindos à nossa reunião do Dr. Nestor de Barros 2023. Eu sou Erika Endo, médica assistente do Instituto de Radiologia do Estado das Clínicas da Faculdade de Medicina da USP. Lembrando que se vocês gostam das nossas reuniões e nossos conteúdos, vocês podem comprar nossos cursos de ultrassonografia e ressonância com aulas online, que são super rápidas, no formato diferente que vocês podem assistir no conforto da sua casa ou em qualquer lugar. É só acessar o portal inradiando.com.br, que está na descrição do vídeo. E hoje, iniciando Outubro Rosa, a reunião vai ser diferente, porque será toda em inglês. Mas não se acanhe, aproveite a oportunidade para comentar e fazer perguntas. No YouTube, você pode ativar a tradução online. Então, essa reunião ficará gravada no YouTube para que vocês possam rever. E acho que também fica com essa tradução automática para o português. Então, não se esqueça de se inscrever no nosso canal, clicar no sininho para as notificações e dar um like para aumentar o compartilhamento desse conhecimento. E se você está ao vivo, não perca a oportunidade de participar da reunião fazendo perguntas e comentários, aproveitar o nosso professor. It is with great honor and enthusiasm that I announce our esteemed guest speaker for our webinar, Dr. Daniel Kopans, a global reference in the early diagnosis of breast cancer, professor of radiology at Harvard Medical School, founder of Breast Imaging Division of the MD8 Massachusetts General Hospital, and author of the best-selling text and reference on breast imaging called Breast Imaging. So with you, I firmly believe that his expertise will greatly enrich our audience's understanding of the subject, fiction, and facts about breast cancer screening.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. First of all, my disclosures. I'm a consultant to DART Imaging, which is building tomosynthesis devices for China. I'm on the board of Malcova, which is developing a novel breast CT system, and I receive royalties from Izzy Medical for my localization system. If anyone has any questions that I don't cover or you don't understand, please feel free to email me at dcopans@verizon.net. Unfortunately, I don't speak Portuguese. I apologize for that. I have enough trouble with English, but I'll do my best to answer your questions. Of course, what we've been through with the COVID pandemic, at least in the United States, has exposed the tragic consequences that result from ignoring science and evidence and relying on, as we learned in the US, so-called alternative facts and misinformation. What I'm going to try and do is provide you with, unfortunately, multiple examples of misinformation that have been promoted over the decades concerning breast cancer screening, to give you facts that have resolved many of the false claims, and to describe some of the specific issues that have been used to produce misinformation. I hope we all agree that mammography screening is one of the major medical advances in the last 50 years. It's undergone greater challenges and more scrutiny than any other test that I know of. Unfortunately, opposition has persisted for over a half a century. The debate has been going on for so long that many of you may be unaware of a lot of the misinformation that's been promoted, so I'm going to take you through it. Decades of misinformation has confused the issues, and I hope to clarify those. So one of the most recent claims, that actually is a repeat claim, it first came up in the early part of the century: screening doesn't work because it doesn't reduce all-cause mortality. That's the false claim. And one of the recent articles just came out in JAMA Internal Medicine, where they made the claim that detecting breast cancer early doesn't reduce ultimate death rates. The main outcome measures that they used were life years gained by screening was calculated as a difference in observed lifetime in the screening versus the no screening groups and computed absolute lifetime gain in days. And then they claimed that the current evidence does not substantiate the claim that common cancer screening tests save lives by extending lifetime. That's just simply false. They were falsely claiming that the reduction in deaths from breast cancer in the randomized controlled trials did not reduce the total number of deaths from all causes. And I would just point out, and this unfortunately is ignored, if you don't know what you're talking about, it's probably a good idea to not talk about it. This was just complete nonsense. How it got past peer review is another question. One of the two trials that the authors used to come up to this conclusion were the Canadian National Breast Screening Studies. It's now been shown conclusively that the Canadian National Breast Screening Studies violated the fundamental requirements of randomized controlled trials. They had an unblinded allocation and actually loaded the screening arm with women who were destined to die from breast cancer. The data from the CNBSS are unreliable and shouldn't be used, and certainly have no use in this most recent evaluation. Furthermore, all-cause mortality can't be evaluated in screening trials since the vast majority of women who die in breast cancer screening trials, because they're from the general population, are women who die from causes other than breast cancer. Even in a breast cancer screening trial, most of the deaths are not due to breast cancer. You'd need an enormous trial to look at all-cause mortality in screening. Now, all-cause mortality is very important in treatment trials because you want to be sure that if the treatment works, first of all, that it's not causing unexpected deaths for other reasons. So, for example, in the radiation therapy trials, by looking at all-cause mortality, they realized that by radiating the heart and damaging coronary vessels, that they actually caused harm that they hadn't expected. So all-cause mortality in treatment trials makes sense because the majority of people who die, for example, in a breast cancer treatment trial, the majority of women in treatment trials are going to die of the cancer because they all have breast cancer. And they won't die, there won't be more deaths from all causes. So that reducing all-cause mortality or looking at all-cause mortality in a treatment trial makes complete sense. In screening trials, you're looking at a normal population, and a relatively small number of women develop cancer in screening trials, and even a small number die. Most deaths in a screening trial will be due to causes other than breast cancer. So in the US, for example, each year, only in our population, only 3% of deaths from all causes are due to breast cancer. So if we were to reduce those deaths by 30%, which is what the screening trial showed, that would reduce total mortality by 1%. So to see a reduction in 1% in all-cause mortality, you'd need, and this has been estimated by Tabar, 2.5 million women, actually a little more than that, in a screening trial to look at all-cause mortality. The screening trials weren't designed to look at all-cause mortality because it didn't make any sense. However, if you look at women who were diagnosed with breast cancer in the screening trials, which make them more like a treatment group, so all of the women that you look at have breast cancer, in fact, Tabar has shown that reducing deaths from breast cancer reduces deaths from all causes among those women, which is a much more reasonable way of looking at things. So what I hope to get across in the few minutes that we have together is that there are truths, there are facts that we need to look for and we need to understand, and we need to understand when people are playing with the facts. The earth is not flat. If anyone believes it's flat, I'm happy to discuss it with you later. I'm not going to take the time now. It is worth periodically to review all this because all this misinformation builds up in the overall understanding of breast cancer screening, and the misinformation gets accepted when it should never have. So just to give you some idea of what's been going on, this goes back to the 1950s. before many of you were born, I'm sure. And at that time, it was argued that breast cancer was systemic before you could find it. And so there was no reason to look for it early because you couldn't make a difference. And this is when people started looking at systemic treatment for breast cancer. In the 1960s, there was the first randomized controlled trial of breast cancer screening called the Health Insurance Plan of New York study. And this showed that, in fact, you could reduce deaths from breast cancer by finding it early. So this disproved that initial false claim. In the 1960s, once the Health Insurance Plan of New York was showing a benefit, people were saying, well, we can't possibly screen all the women that we need to screen. And this was disproven by the Breast Cancer Detection Demonstration Project done in the 1970s, where more than 275,000 women were screened efficiently and effectively over a 5-year period. Here are some of the data from the BCDDP. And you can see that even this early on in screening, 42% of the breast cancers are found only by mammography, but this showed that we could screen large numbers of women. Then in the 1970s, and this had gone on for many, many years, as you all know, radiation from mammography was claimed that radiation from mammography would cause more cancers than would be cured. Because of this, the BCDDP actually stopped screening women in their 40s. It caused a lot of concern. The breast is susceptible to radiation while it is developing. That's pretty clear. I believe, although there's no way of proving this, that it's because there's a high concentration of stem cells in the undifferentiated breast, the adolescent breast, for example, women in their early 20s. And stem cells it's very hard to take a differentiated cell and hit it with radiation and de-differentiate it and make it become a cancer cell. I think it can happen, but it's hard. Stem cells, on the other hand, haven't differentiated, and it's probably a lot easier to cause a stem cell to become a malignancy. So when there are a lot of stem cells around, it's probably a good idea not to do a lot of radiation. And this was shown, of course, teenagers at Hiroshima and Nagasaki who were exposed to radiation. There was an increased risk, but subsequent studies have shown, and even the Hiroshima Nagasaki data showed, that the risk of developing breast cancer with radiation drops rapidly with increasing age. And after the age of 30, there's probably little, if any, risk. Certainly by age 40, there's no measurable risk. And I would argue because although the breast differentiates rapidly with a full-term pregnancy, it may take into the late 20s, early 30s, and maybe even later in some women for terminal differentiation to take place and a reduction in stem cells. This is just a summary slide of multiple studies that show how the risk from radiation drops rapidly with increasing age. So by the age of 40, there's really no demonstrable risk. And even the extrapolated risk, you can't measure the risk in older women 40 and over, because the risk is so small. But even if you extrapolate it, it's well below even the smallest benefit. And for those of you who want to go into this in more detail, there are multiple studies that have looked at radiation risk and explained that it really drops rapidly with increasing age. People still argue, oh, the radiation from mammograms is going to cause cancer. There's absolutely no evidence of that, And the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, the American College of Physicians, which have opposed screening before the age of 50, don't use radiation really as an argument anymore. Now, then the argument came up in the 1980s. There's no benefit from screening women ages 40 to 49. This came about actually because the investigators in the Health Insurance Plan of New York study wanted to see what influence age might have on their results. They were showing a decrease in deaths, but they thought, well, did menopause have any effect? Not so much age, but menopause. have an effect on their results. They hadn't collected data on menopause, so they used the age of 50 as a surrogate for menopause, the average age of menopause. So that was really the birth of age 50 as being anything. It's actually a meaningless age. But what they did was really statistically okay if you want to think about your next screening trial, for example, but it's not okay to make recommendations to people when what you do has no statistical power. So what they did was they looked at women 50 to 64 separately. The trial was not designed to let them do this, but they did it anyhow. And you can see in the 50 to 64, it looks like the death rate, that's the distance between the control women and the women who got mammograms and clinical breast exam, the death rate went down immediately after screening started. Whereas when they looked at women ages 40 to 49, remember the trial was not designed to do this. They did it anyhow. They looked at 40 to 49 and it looked like there was no benefit for about 5 years, and then the curves start going apart. So what they concluded was that the benefit was for women 50 and over and not for women 40 to 49, which is a false claim because the trials weren't designed to do this. And actually, if you look at this, this makes no sense. The 50 to 64 curves, probably this was due to statistical fluctuation. When you have small numbers, for example, you can flip a coin 5 times and it will come up heads 5 times in a row, but you've got to flip it more times to get what the actual probability is, which is 50-50. So in fact, the data in HIP for women 40 to 49 was what they would have expected. You don't save lives immediately because the fast-growing cancers come up between screens. You don't see them this year, and in 2 years from now, you can feel them. And so screening really reduces deaths from moderate and slower growing cancers. It still reduces deaths, but it doesn't get the ones that are going to kill somebody next year. That just doesn't make any sense. And so the investigators were deluded by the fact that it looks like there's an immediate benefit when in fact that was just statistical fluctuation. And the actual expected reduction doesn't occur for 4 or 5 years. And here are data from the 30-year results of the Swedish 2 county trials that shows exactly this. The curves don't start diverging for about 4 or 5 years, and then you can see there's a dramatic decrease in deaths among the screened population. The question about screening women in their 40s was finally proven with longer follow-up, where there's a statistically significant reduction in deaths. This is for all women in 8 randomized controlled trials. All of the women had a reduction, all the trials had a reduction in death in a meta-analysis. You can see the Canadian trials, these are the 2 Canadian trials, which are major outliers. If you're to the left of one, that means there's a benefit. To the right, there's no benefit. And this was proven and published in 1997 after the Consensus Development Conference that was held in Washington that showed a statistically significant reduction for screening women while they're in their 40s. So this is the absolute proof. When you look at women 40 to 49 separately, even though the trials weren't designed to do this, if you wait long enough, the statistical power increases. Unfortunately, more women die. And you can see that there's statistically significant mortality reduction for screening women while they're in their 40s. So that was the proof that disproved the claim there was no benefit. In the 1990s, our National Cancer Institute held a workshop on breast cancer screening that promoted more misinformation. The chairperson at the NCI has always been opposed to screening women in their 40s. Not sure why. I think it has to do with a few individuals who just staked that out as their position and they continued with it. The chairperson for that was I would say, a loaded meeting. The chairperson had already written that we should stop screening women in their 40s. I was the only one who was invited to defend screening for women in their 40s, despite I think the total faculty for that was 25, so it was just me against 24. And there were a few people who were called to support screening, but I was the only one who supported screening, who was supposed to support screening 40 to 49. And the workshop based its results on the Canadian National Breast Screening Studies that we worried about, and now it's been shown that they violated the fundamental rules of randomized controlled trials and loaded the sides. But anyhow, this meeting looked at, again, unplanned retrospective subgroup analyses that we wrote about, that you can't do that and advise people because you don't have the statistical power in the trials. And then I also raised concerns back in 1993 and 97 about the Canadian National Breast Screening Studies. Now, this is not me, this is an expert in statistics. If a trial with negative results has insufficient statistical power, a clinically important but statistically non-significant effect is usually ignored, or worse, is taken to mean the treatment made no difference. So we've known about this since 1994, that you have to have statistical power. Otherwise, you'd only need 2 people in your trial. If statistical power wasn't important, you would only have to have 1 person in the screen group and 1 person in the control group. These are the data from all the trials put together for all the women, not just 40 to 49, but for all the women, about a little less than 500,000 women, screen group, control group. We looked at this in the trials all together to look at women 40 to 49, and we published a paper. This is what I presented at the 1993 Consensus Development Conference, that to have the 80% power to prove a 25% mortality reduction, as the National Cancer Institute was asking at the time, with a follow-up of 5 years, you would need 470, almost 500,000 women in the trial, half in the screen group, half in the control group, to show what the NCI was requiring in their 1993 conference. Well, it turns out that if you look at the number of women under the age of 50 in all the trials put together at the time, there were 166,000. So that was actually about 1/3 the number of women you would have had to have in the trials to be able to have a statistically significant study. So they basically, and this has been done over and over again, broke out women 40 to 49 when they didn't have sufficient data to allow them to do that. So disregarding the science, women were advised to wait until 50 and get screened every 2 years. We raised the concerns. They were ignored even in this was the summary of the workshop, where there was one line, I think it said that some people have suggested the trials lack statistical power to do this, and then they went ahead and did it anyhow. So this is kind of the history of what's going on in the debates about breast cancer screening, where people bring up scientifically unsupportable arguments. We counter the arguments with science, and they just kind of go ahead and ignore it. Again, NCI continued to not support screening women in their 40s. This was supported by other nonsense, where this is a paraphrase of Cindy Pearson, who was a nurse who was opposed to screening women in their 40s, and she was on national television claiming that screening would lead to biopsies of benign lesions that will, quote, permanently scar the breast, so that when a woman has a lump, mammography will be useless. I like to say for radiologists, these are 3 false claims in a single breath hold. This is just nonsense. We actually did a study on this and showed that mammography, first of all, mammography, we don't save it to diagnose palpable abnormalities. That's just silly. It's a screening test. By the time a woman has a lump, the value of early detection has been lost, and properly performed surgery rarely leaves any confusion on subsequent mammograms. And at the end of 1993,
Excuse me, Dr. Kopans, the sound is not, it's not on for us. We heard about at the end of 1993.
See my slides now?
Yes, yes.
All right, all right, so I'm just gonna go over this. That's really US stuff, but the point is that even major reviews
you,
by supposedly scientific organizations have supported false claims. So one of the major false claims that a lot of people still use is that the age of 50 is a legitimate threshold for screening. There are zero, and I would challenge anyone to find ungrouped data, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute, that show that any of the factors associated with screening change abruptly at the age of 50. But people have disregarded this. This is a paper by Kurlikowski et al., where they claimed that there was a sudden change in cancer detection at age 40. So this is the paper, and what they do is they compared women ages 30 to 49. Remember, no one was talking about screening women in their 30s, really, but they included women in their 30s, and they took the average number of cancers detected, 2 per thousand, and they compared them to all the older women, 50 to over 70. And oh, there were 10 cancers per thousand women. So they used this apparent jump to claim that something happened at the age of 50, when in fact, if you look at their paper, you can see if you look at women 40 to 49 compared to 50 to 59, for example, much closer and statistically not significantly different, although we know there are fewer cancers in younger women. But they use this to take data that look like this and made them look like this. This was published in JAMA, and they got away with it, 2 cancers per thousand, 10 cancers per thousand. And people use this to argue against screening women in their 40s. This was a fellow from the Dartmouth Institute. They've been arguing against cancer screening women in their 40s for years, and they cited this paper saying that clearly mammography is much more efficient in detecting breast cancers in older women. That's just nonsense. It's not true. Opponents of screening have repeatedly grouped and averaged the data as if these groups are uniform, when in fact we know the incidence of breast cancer goes up steadily with increasing age. So let me show you how this is done. If you look at this graph in the upper left, I took the approximate breast cancer incidence at age 40, say about 1 cancer per thousand, and then it goes up steadily to about 5 cancers per thousand by age 80. So it's a steady increase. I just made a spreadsheet with these numbers. So you can see it's going up steadily with increasing age. If I group and average the women 40 to 49 and compare them to 50 to 74, it looks like there's a huge jump. In other words, you put all of the women under 40 together and average them, and then 50 and over and average them, and it looks like it jumps suddenly. This is what Kurlikowski did. This is what a U.S. Preventive Services Task Force has done. Do it by decades, 10 years, and you still make it look like it's jumping. It's not, and everybody should know that, but they get away with doing this and making the claim that there's a sudden change at the age of 50. None of the parameters of screening, and you can look at your own data, none of the parameters of screening change abruptly at the age of 50 or any other age, and I would challenge anyone to find any data that are not grouped and averaged that show that 50 has any significance. These are data from the Mass General Hospital a number of years ago, where we looked at the women who were recalled for additional evaluation based on individual age, 40, 41, 42, 43, and so on. You can see nothing happens at the age of 50. This is the recall rate. It goes down slightly as women get older, but that also means they have previous mammograms, so we probably call back fewer women because we have older mammograms to compare. This is the biopsies recommended, and you can see much more statistical fluctuation because there are fewer numbers, but you can see nothing happens at 50. It basically is a flat line. We recommend about the same percent of biopsies, regardless of age. And the yield of cancer, surprise, surprise, goes up steadily with increasing age. It's not a surprise. That's what we would expect, and that's what happens. There's nothing that happens at the age of 50. And again, I would challenge you to look at your own data, and our national data show this as well. The cancer detection rate increases steadily with increasing age, along with a steady increase in breast cancer in the population. There's no abrupt change at age. Age 50 is a completely artificial and false threshold. It's being used all around the world, but it has no basis in science. I think it's just used to limit access to screening. In 1997, the National Cancer Institute revisited our screening guidelines. I'm not going to bore you with all this. The meeting that was held, Consensus Development Conference, was supposed to be objective, but it wasn't. It was, again, a loaded group. But the group was told that the randomized controlled trials showed a statistically significant mortality reduction for women in their 40s as high as 44%. And again, here are the data that show that decrease in deaths. And yet the CDC, this large National Cancer Institute review, ignored the data and claimed that there was no benefit for women. And we dropped support for screening women in their 40s in the US with some groups. The bottom line is mammography has been shown scientifically to reduce deaths for women 40 to 74, period. And again, it was falsely claimed that there's no benefit from screening women at any age. This was a subsequent paper by Gotchi and Olson in the Lancet. It turns out that the peer reviewers said this shouldn't have been published, but the Lancet published it because it was going to be controversial and they wanted to stimulate the discussion. Incredibly enough, with all the anger that was released because this paper got published, the Lancet let them do it again. I've never heard of this, a so-called do-over. And they republished their false claims in 2001. There were multiple reviews, including one by me, that looked at different aspects of what Gotchi and Olson had done that showed that their analysis was not valid. Nevertheless, some misinformation was out there. This was because it was from the Cochrane collaboration, which Gotchi had been part of, highly respected and independent group. But eventually, Gotchi was fired because of many of the things that he did that were not scientifically supportable. One of the things he said was that the Canadian trial was one of the only fairly well done trials. Turns out the Canadian trial violated fundamental rules for randomized controlled trials and was probably the worst of the trials. And then they claimed that Malmo didn't show a benefit. This was one of the screening trials when in fact it did show a benefit. So there were huge false claims in this paper, but it got a lot of coverage. Again, now has been discredited that there is clearly a benefit for screening women from 40 to 74. Just a few facts about the Canadian National Breast Screening Study. The Canadians are trying to get University of Toronto to withdraw these papers because the studies were done improperly. The mammography in the Canadian National Breast Screening Studies was terrible. Only 32% of the cancers in this study done in the 1980s were found only by mammography. Remember, I showed you in the BCDDP, 42% were found only by mammography. So 10 years later, they were worse than the BCDDP. There was a statistically significant excess of women with palpable advanced cancers who were assigned to the screening arm. more women with positive lymph nodes, and the size of the cancers was larger in the screening arms than the women having usual care. So the Canadian National Breast Screening Studies should not be used in determining screening guidelines, and I suspect that the papers will ultimately be withdrawn because the trials were compromised. Now everybody's saying, oh, the harms of screening, recalls for some extra images or an ultrasound are being called false positives, which makes it sound like we're telling women they have breast cancer when they don't. The promoters of overdiagnosis, which I touched on at the beginning, are claiming that there are breast cancers that disappear on their own. There have been several reports of large clinically evident cancers that have gone away in the breast before treatment. These can be labeled as miracles. They don't happen. They rarely happen. In fact, in the US, a review of 40 centers that looked at their data of women who, for whatever reason, had delayed or didn't get treated for their breast cancers, and none of them regressed or went away. But this has been used to claim that there are cancers that would disappear on their own if we hadn't found them by mammography, so-called overdiagnosis. The American College of Physicians picked up on this in 2007 and dropped support for screening women in their 40s. This was picked up by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Wait until 50 and then get screened every 2 years. Massive overdiagnosis was claimed. A paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, which has been terrible. It has an unpublished bias against mammography screening. This paper claimed that 70,000 breast cancers in 1 year alone would have been ignored if would have gone away if they weren't found by mammography. The authors actually had no data on mammography, and they just made it up. They basically said it was their best guess. And just to show you how this was done, these are actual data from the United States on incidence of breast cancer. You can see around the mid-1980s, there's a sudden increase in incidence and then it comes back down. This is nothing more than a standard prevalence curve. We didn't start screening everyone in the 1980s. Women started getting screened periodically and more, and then it sort of plateaued in 1990. So this was all first screeners in a large number. And what Blyer and Welch claimed was that the incidence of breast cancer would have been a flat line had mammography not been instituted. Well, in fact, and you can look at this in your country, the incidence of breast cancer in the United States and Connecticut Tumor Registry going back to 1940 had been increasing steadily long before there was any breast cancer screening. Here's where screening began in the US. You can see the incidence had gone up steadily. This paper in the New England Journal of Medicine ignored this. And here are data again from the Connecticut Tumor Registry. Note that the overall incidence of invasive breast cancer, this goes back to 1940, going up steadily. Screening began probably around the 1980s, and the death rate and the advanced cancers dropped relatively quickly once screening has begun. And you can see the increasing incidence before screening in Iceland. These are data from Iceland. The annual percentage change was about 2% per year. The background incidence of breast cancer had been going up steadily, and the mortality then starts to go down after screening begins. Here in Finland, again, the incidence going up before there's any screening. Here in Denmark, you can see the red line is the incidence going up before there was any screening. This is when there's screening program yet. So, and also in Sweden, same thing. The incidence of breast cancer going up steadily before there's any screening. Well, Blyer and Welch in the New England Journal of Medicine article said, well, it might have gone up by 0.25% per year. What we saw is going up by 1 to 2% per year. So this line is just a completely fake line, but they claim that the distance between the actual incidence of breast cancer and the expected incidence was much different. So this is what they were claiming was the expected incidence. This was the actual incidence. So they said, well, these must all be fake cancers. But if you took the actual increase over time, in fact, there were fewer invasive breast cancers. This is based on data from the Connecticut Tumor Registry showing the increase since 1940. And you can see there are actually fewer invasive cancers. Now, how can that be? Well, I can't prove it, but I would suspect that it's because we were finding ductal carcinoma in situ, removing them back here, so that the rate of invasive cancers is actually lower than what would have been expected. Anyhow, this has gone on and on. Blyer and Welch himself continues to ignore the fact that the baseline incidence had been going up and came up with all kinds of other arguments. One of the other arguments was that, well, the rate of advanced cancers hasn't diminished. In fact, multiple studies have shown that the rate of advanced cancers has diminished as screening has been introduced. These are all the papers that have looked at this. And then we've come back to all-cause mortality. I'm going to just skip this because we talked about this early on. You can't look at all-cause mortality unless you have large enough databases. Now, the next argument is, well, let's just screen based on risk. And the problem with that is that the vast majority of women who are diagnosed with breast cancer each year have any demonstrable risk. So, for example, BRCA1, BRCA2 mutations only account for about 10% of women who are diagnosed with breast cancer each year. So if we only screen these women, we'd miss 90% of the cancer. If you add women with a family history, then that would bring it to about 25%, which means that if you screen women at high risk, family history or genetic mutation, you'd miss 75% of breast cancers. And the other point is that no one has proven that screening only high-risk women will save any lives. None of the randomized controlled trials looked at this. Now, I think screening high-risk women makes good sense, and I would screen them more aggressively, alternating mammography with magnetic resonance imaging every 6 months. But there's no proof that will save screening high-risk women. So the bottom line is screening has consistently shown a decrease in breast cancer deaths for women 40 to 49 of approximately 30%. It's been estimated that if we screen women starting at the age of 40 every year, we could reduce breast cancer deaths by about 50%. These are data from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force and the modeling data in what's called the CISNET models in the U.S. And you can see here the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, prior to this recent change, start at 50 and screen every 2 years. You can see you reduce mortality by a little over 23%, 24%, I think. Whereas if you start screening at the age of 40 annually, you reduce deaths by 40%. So the bottom line is most women who develop breast cancer are not at increased risk. All women are at risk, and annual screening beginning at the age of 40 should be encouraged for all women. So I'm going to stop my sharing now and turn it back over, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Anybody still conscious?
Thank you very much, Dr. Kopans, for your presentation and your engagement in discussing this difficult subject holds tremendous value, especially given the prevalence of misinformation surrounding this critical topic. And following your scientific thinking is very enlightening and are of the utmost importance for the world, I think so. So let's open it up to questions from the audience. Do you want to begin, Shimis?
Hi, Dr. Kopans. First, thank you very much for you joining us. It's a pleasure, it's a honor to have you with us today. And my question is about a mammogram has shown a big technological advances through the years, since through the first trial. Uh, and nowadays, you have digital mammograms and tomo. Don't you think that this evolution can lead to more mortality, reduction in mortality for breast cancer, even with advances in systemic therapy?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. One of the problems that we've had with these pseudo-scientific arguments, like arguments that have actually turned out to not be scientifically supportable, is they've distracted many of us from moving forward. So, for example, when I first thought of and developed digital breast tomosynthesis, that was in the early 90s. It took 20 years to get that out and clinically available. Magnetic resonance imaging would be the best way to find more cancers and probably save many more lives. And yet we haven't been able to do randomized controlled trial of MRI and so on. So the problem is mammography is very good. We've, I think, been the major reason deaths from breast cancer have dropped by over 40%, certainly in the US since mammography screening began, but it's not the ultimate answer. In fact, I thought when I started in the field in 1978 that I'd read the mammograms for a few years and then they'd find a cure for breast cancer and I could go do something else. Clearly, we don't have a cure for breast cancer. We can't cure metastatic breast cancer. So the goal is to find it and treat it before it's successfully metastatic. And I think that has been delayed. Our ability to do that better has been delayed by all these nonsense, non-scientific arguments that have been thrown in the way of mammography. So mammography is a good start, and we've gotten better at mammography. We now have digital breast tomosynthesis, which should be the fundamental screening test because it finds more breast cancers at a time when they're curable. But that we shouldn't stop there. We need, and you guys, the youth in this field, have to find even better ways to detect early breast cancer because mammography is not the ultimate answer.
In Brazil, we noticed that we have cancer in earlier ages, different than United States. Someone of the audience is asking for. Can you have a guess why it's happening in development countries?
Uh, I don't have any hard data on that. The reason we use age 40 is because the people who ran the randomized controlled trials wanted to see what screening did for women. In order to do that, someone has to pay for the trial. So the ages were in fact a lot involved with how much it cost to do these trials. They're very expensive. So they looked at age 40 because there were 1 to 2 women per thousand being diagnosed with breast cancer at age 40. And that was enough so that they could run a trial and have enough women and pay for it. In fact, some of the trials didn't have enough women, and like the Stockholm trial was too small, and so on. But the point is that there's nothing magical about age 40, and in fact, back in the 70s here in the United States, we were getting what we'll call baseline mammograms at age 35. The theory being, let's get mammograms at a time when women probably don't have breast cancer and see what their normal breast tissue looks like so we can compare it to future studies and see what's changed. Uh, in one study from Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, they found in women at age 35, 2 cancers per 1,000 women, which was about the same as age 40. So, you know, basically, a woman in her late 30s probably has a very similar risk to a woman in her early 40s. Nothing happens at 40. The problem is that the people who decide healthcare policy and insurance and so on require that you have randomized controlled trial proof before they will pay to screen women. So we argue from the randomized controlled trials where there's proof. But no, you're absolutely right. There's nothing magical about 40. And why are there more cancers being found in young women? I don't know the answer to that. It's probably environmental. The fact that women who have better nutrition go through menarche, start having their periods at younger ages. And it's been shown that the more menstrual cycles that someone goes through, where the breast premenstrually undergoes cell proliferation, so you have to copy DNA and to make new cells, and then with a period there's apoptosis, so some of the cells die, and then there's proliferation with the next cycle and so on. The more hormone cycles that the breast is exposed to increases the risk of developing breast cancer. So I suspect there are multiple reasons, including the fact that we're probably looking for it too. A woman who developed and died of breast cancer in her 30s may have been, diagnosed as dying of bone cancer because the only thing they really knew about in the past were her metastatic lesions, and they didn't know that the primary came from the breast. I know that's not a satisfactory answer, but the real answer is there's nothing magical at 40, and we should start thinking about what we can do for younger women.
And what do you think about this subject, about the link with the increase of heavy metals and pesticides in foods? Like, dark chocolates with heavy metals in the lignite and chocolates like that. And in Brazil and developing countries, we don't have this much regulation about pesticides in foods, Maybe, do you think, is it linked? Do you think it's affordable to test this kind of population or in the blood test? What do you think about this?
Well, I'm not an expert in nutritional factors. There's no question that there are environmental issues going on. Again, as I point out, I think nutrition in general, for example, in countries that are more advanced and people have access to better nutrition, even if some of the food is well, it may have to do with the fact that some of the food contains things that you don't want, but where people are better nourished, women mature earlier. The breast goes through menarche. At the turn of the last century, 1900s in the United States, the age of menarche was 17. In the US now, I think it's down around 12 or 11, something like that. So the breast is being subjected to more hormone cycles. And I personally think that a lot of breast cancers are initiated. In other words, the first cell damage takes place, early in life. Again, probably a stem cell is my belief, and that before the breast is differentiated. And it may take 20 years or more for a single cell, if you do the cell doubling times of a fast cell doubling time is every 60 days. 120 is about average, and then it gets slower and slower. And no one can prove that. There are old studies that we derive that from. But it may take 20 plus years for a single cell to become a 2 centimeter cancer that you become clinically aware of. And so we don't know what really is causing these cancers. Some of them may be spontaneous, but I suspect a lot of them have to do with what we eat and what we breathe and what we drink, but I can't prove that.
Um, any questions for the audience? Pessoal, vocês podem fazer perguntas aqui no chat e eu posso tentar traduzir aqui para vocês, para o professor, se
Eu tenho uma
vocês
questão,
quiserem.
eu tenho uma pergunta.
Pode falar, Vera, por
Oi,
favor.
então, Dr. Kopans, hi.
Right?
I'd like to ask you two questions. One, what do you think is the future of mammography screening with so many misinformations that coming back and forth all these years? And the second question is if you could make some comments about the new task force recommendation, please.
Okay. Let me just start with the second question first. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force finally started adhering to science. You have to realize our task forces don't include experts in breast cancer screening. The claim is to avoid conflicts of interest, but it's also, I think, to be able to manipulate people who know nothing about the field. It's like asking me to develop guidelines for neurosurgery. I could do it, but I don't think you'd want me doing it. There are no experts in breast cancer screening on these task forces, so it's taken us years of working to the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, pointing out to them the misinformation and the errors, many of the things and more of the things that I talked about today, that they finally realized that they were wrong. There's nothing that happens at 50, and the arguments against screening women in their 40s make no sense. For example, if you say, well, we reduce overdiagnosis by waiting until age 50, the only way that would work is if the cancers that you would find among women in their 40s that are not real, that would go away, have to disappear by age 50. Otherwise, you'll find them at age 50 and you'll have the same overdiagnosis. So they kind of play both ends against the middle, as we say. No one's ever seen a mammographically detected breast cancer disappear. They will still be there at age 50. So the argument it's to reduce overdiagnosis is ridiculous. I think the other question, as I recall, was how do we deal with this?
What's
and the answer is particularly you younger folk, need to get interested and learn all this stuff. And when people come up with misinformation, you have to call them out and write to the journals that are publishing misinformation, and get letters to the editor and so on, and do the studies yourselves that counter the misinformation. That's I don't have any other solutions. I can't get a letter to the editor, for example, in the New England Journal of Medicine. They don't want to hear the facts. They've just taken a position that they don't support screening, particularly women in their 40s, and they won't publish anything that doesn't argue for that. But you need, one of the reasons I'm glad that you invited me to speak is to try and encourage you to learn this stuff and understand it, so that when you have people in your own practices, as I'm sure you have, who say, well, there's no benefit before the age of 50, or there's all this overdiagnosis. Yeah, show me one. No one has ever seen a mammographically detected breast cancer disappear on its own. There may be overdiagnosis. I have no doubt that, and if you look at the treatment information, 100 women may get chemotherapy for their breast cancers when there's a 3% benefit. It's still done because we all want a 3% benefit. But that means you're over treating, 97 or 96 women to get a 3% benefit. But, I might do that myself if I was in that situation. So you got to be careful with the numbers. You have to understand the information. And for you young people, I learned early on, I listened to a surgical colleague who seemed to know everything. He knew my literature, he knew his literature, and so on. It's a lot of work, but you need to be able to go, as we say, toe to toe with people who are creating false information and point it out and make sure that you spread the facts as best you can. That puts a lot of pressure on you guys. I'm counting on you.
Thanks.
Alguém tem mais alguma questão da audiência? Todo mundo pode participar. E se tiver muita pergunta, Dr. Kopans will be happy to answer any questions, or if there's no time, he can answer in subsequent emails. If you want, I can send to him. And
Yeah, please, if you send me an email, just remind me that you were, at my talk and that's who you are. So I don't
okay.
say
Yes.
that you're spam or something.
Ninguém tiver mais uma pergunta, acho que eu vou fazer. So, Dr. Kopans, I have another question. The RCT studies are so expensive and takes too long to be done, mainly with reduction mortality causes. And probably it's not likely to be done again with new imaging methods. And do you think we can rely on other surrogate endpoints like interval cancers to test the new imaging modalities?
That's a very good question. First of all, I would say they're more expensive 10 years from now than they would be now. So, for example, back in 2000, there was some money that became available. It's a long story. It's a political error that was done. But anyhow, there was money that became available, and we had a conference call, and the doctor who led it said, anybody have any ideas what we should be studying? And I said we should do a randomized controlled trial of magnetic resonance imaging screening. Remember, this is 23 years ago, because we had been finding contralateral cancers in the women who were participating in our MRI studies. And so back in 2000, $25 million could have been spent on an MRI randomized controlled trial. We know today that it saves lives, but instead.
Dr. Kopans, it's off. Your sound is off. Sorry.
Okay, here.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, it's okay.
Okay. So what I was going to say is, if you don't do the studies now, they're going to be more expensive later on. And the problem with surrogate endpoints, if you reduce advanced cancers, for example, that's good. That's probably a good surrogate endpoint. But there are still women who die from breast cancer who have small cancer. They don't have advanced cancers. They have stage 1 and early stage 2 cancers. That if you find them earlier, you save their lives. Those won't be detected using surrogate endpoints. So, for example, the TMIS trial, which is looking at tomosynthesis, which is it's a waste of $100 million to look at tomosynthesis when we know tomosynthesis finds more cancer. If you're going to do a randomized controlled trial, use death as an endpoint. Don't use surrogate endpoints, because you'll miss a lot of reduced deaths by doing that. But anyhow, they waste that money. Tomosynthesis is already, at least in the U.S., has spread all over the U.S. It's a so-called cat is out of the bag, so it's silly to do a randomized controlled trial of that. Now, contrast enhanced mammography, which is still, even though it's been around for 20 years, is still in its infancy. It hasn't been adopted by many people yet. That's a good one to do a randomized controlled trial. And they can look at advanced cancers as an early measure, but you need to look at deaths. Mortality is unfortunately the only proof. And, it just depends. Do you want to save lives? I mean, they're pouring billions of dollars into treatment, and I support that. And it's obviously the best to only treat, people who have the cancer and not bother anyone else. But take some of that money and study early detection, because treatment can't cure women who've got metastatic breast cancer. So I support the money going into treatment, but there should be more money going into early detection.
I think this is the last question for the audience. They are asking about the radiation in tomosynthesis. What do you think about it?
Well, it's meaningless, but you can't take my word for it. as I showed you at the beginning, and I would urge you to go and look at the published radiation literature. Martin Yaffe, for example, a physicist from Toronto, and Main Prize, one of his colleagues have written a good article. There's no data to prove that there's any radiation risk for women 40 and over, because the risk, if it exists, is so low that you can't measure it. Even high doses show, like treatment doses barely show any increased risk. So I'm not concerned about doing a full field mammogram and the tomographic slices, which is what we recommend. Synthetic mammography is better. We did it back when we developed DBT back in 2000. We developed our own synthetic 2D, and it had all kinds of artifacts that looked like calcifications until we realized that it was from the synthesis that we were using. So I'm not concerned about the extra dose, and you clearly find more cancers. I mean, the study that you could do, that people should do, is to get the 2D mammograms and the tomosynthesis images, but read the 2D mammograms first without looking at the planar image, without looking at the slices, and put in your diagnosis, and then look at the slices and see how many cancers you couldn't see on the 2D. It'll be probably about 30%. And that's a big deal. So, I think tomosynthesis is important. I'd be careful using synthetic mammograms, because number one, the dose, as I say, is probably inconsequential at that age. And number two, there's a concern you'll miss cancers. And, we're looking for very few cancers per 1,000 women to begin with. If we start missing one or two, that's going to really reduce the effectiveness. So be careful.
I'd like to thank you again for your participation and for all audience. Your presence today undoubtedly make a meaningful impact in all of us. And we hope you can speak again next year at our meeting, and we are hoping for that. And thank you very much in the name of our department, radiology department. Thank you very much, Dr.
Well,
Kopans.
I appreciate the opportunity, and it was, thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you. Bye-bye, people.
Bye now.